Among the civilized races in the galaxy, it was common knowledge that the humans were by far the least formidable. They were new on the galactic scene, just having entered into their interstellar era, and absolutely pathetic compared to their stellar neighbors. Their mightiest armada had been annihilated to a ship by mere pirates hailing from the Atrov Imperium. Their entire industrial might, though it grew exponentially mightier, was put to shame by a single von Neumann swarm of the Celestri Collective. Their population still numbered in the double-digit billions, absolutely insignificant when compared to the trillions of souls living under the aegis of the elder races. Even their artists, the Van Goghs and Mozarts and Villeneuves, were absolutely humiliated by the Aznal Forum when they dared to submit their works in a competition. The Forum's works of arts, it was said, had been insulted by even being compared to such pedestrian creations. Among the stars in the sky, where Atrov battle fleets set worlds afire, and Telebri psionics read minds as easily as books, the human race was an utter speck. A drop in the galactic ocean that even their closest allies assumed would soon wash away into obscurity, or be consumed and destroyed by some greater power. After all, humanity had no real claim to fame. Their biologists had won a minor award in recent years, being honored by the Astran Republic for their ingenious work on studying mutation, but that was but a single achievement. It made them visible for a moment, like a briefly lit candle in a very dark room, but it was snuffed out just as quickly. The Astrans had no use for their work. The galaxy at large was not changed very noticeably by it. Then the Atrov snuffed out a star 2 months later, and suddenly the human race was the last thing on anybody's mind. Humans were weak. They were pathetic. They were insignificant. Until one day they were not. It all began on the far end of the galaxy, in a far more pathetic and just as memorable star nation then known as the Sorbial United Planets. They were the ones to open Pandora's box. A Sorbial colony ship, its name and crew sadly unknown, landed on a distant and unusual world to find it remarkably fascinating and remarkably deadly. Its denizens, having evolved a symbiotic relationship with several strains of microorganisms, were in a constant state of biological warfare against one another. Their internal bacteria, viruses, and the like constantly mutated, constantly shifted, and constantly adapted to new threats and objectives, such that no two specimens had exactly the same internal biome. Where most species used venom, they used viruses. Where most used an immune system, they used strains of defensive bacteria. Where most used blood cells, they used symbiotes. Such an incredible microcosm of life had not been seen before in all the worlds. A planet teeming with diverse and deadly microorganisms. A plague world, it was designated. A world filled with plagues. Naturally, the United Planets immediately deployed a research vessel to study this world and its unique inhabitants. Standard precautions were taken, and decontamination procedures were religiously observed. But soon those standards began to slip. After all, the Sorbial had evolved on an entirely different world than these microorganisms. They were under no real threat from a plague that physically could not infect their cells. Until one day it could. The microorganism that first made the jump was officially identified as Vico 78, a strain of the Vico offensive agent used by an aquatic species on the Sorbial plague world. It was said that the creatures, dubbed Anrans, had the most lethal bite on that entire planet. Study of United Planets records confirmed that Vico had an unusual capacity for mutation, able to overwhelm and destroy the immune systems of the species it infected, and the Sorbial had established enhanced security procedures to minimize the risk of it jumping species. Clearly, these procedures had failed. Officially, the plague was known as Vico 78. Unofficially, it was known as death. It evolved fast, faster than anything the galaxy's doctors had witnessed before, and destroyed or broke past every defensive mechanism a species' immune system could bring to bear against it. So great was its effectiveness that the Sorbial United Planets' rivals accused them of developing a biological weapon that had somehow breached containment. If these accusations were true or false, the galaxy never knew. The Sorbial United Planets were consumed by the infection in just under 3 years. Nearby nations were quick to initiate a quarantine, firing on any ship trying to escape an infected world, but it took them little time to realize they were doomed as well. Vico 78 had developed an incubation period. The exact amount of time varied from strain to strain, making it impossible to determine how long it lasted, or even develop a test against it. Even antibiotics, the galaxy's main medical weapon against diseases of this nature, were next to useless against this debilitating plague. Hospitals were overwhelmed. People began to drop dead in the streets. Even doctors, who now treated their patients clad in airtight suits, soon began to fall ill. Corpses were ordered to be burned. Martial law was swiftly enacted. Armed soldiers began to gun down the infected on sight. Even that was not enough. Worlds fell into anarchy. Soon after, they fell silent. Within only a few short decades, even the elder races of the galaxy had taken notice. How could they not, when entire star nations were being destroyed? Conclaves were established, and the devastating Vico disease was discussed in fearful tones. The death toll of this plague was already in the low trillions, and even the most conservative estimates stated that it had expanded to 1/3 of the entire galaxy. Billions of inhabited worlds, millions of stellar nations, trillions upon trillions of innocent lives. Something had to be done, the elder races agreed. Some way had to be found to end this scourge before the entire galaxy was consumed. The only question remaining was how. The Atrov Imperium was the first to act, and they did so in the harshest manner. Under the Emperor's orders, battle fleets were sent to sterilize infected worlds and enforce strict quarantines against any individual they believed could carry the infection. When even a single case of the plague was enough to destroy a planet, no amount of caution was deemed too extreme. Imperial warships cracked planets in their attempt to contain the virus. Any ship trying to enter Atrov Imperium space was warded off at gunpoint by similar fleets, and all those who ignored this warning were fired upon and destroyed. The Atrov race, mightiest among all the powers of the Milky Way galaxy, had seen the terrors that Vico 78 could cause upon a population. It mutated too fast for any medical science to counter it. New strains of the disease were catalogued in medical rosters constantly, as they evolved to outmaneuver new defenses. Even those species that were less militaristic, such as the pacifist Asnaris, were soon forced to imitate the hated Imperium in an attempt to contain the spread. To anyone infected with the Vico plague, death was certain even without the help of a bullet. Many races denounced the Atrov Imperium for their brutal methods, but as the disease consumed their planets as well, leaving ghost cities and piles of corpses in its wake, they were forced to rely on the same strategies to save what was left. Still, it was not enough. As their homes were destroyed by the plague and their nations fell into anarchy, billions of desperate refugees flooded Atrov space in an attempt to reach the galaxy's strongest bastion against the Vico plague. They were met by Imperium battleships at every turn. Verbal warnings were given. Warning shots came next. Then, finally, the Imperium's cannons began shooting to kill. Some tried to muster war fleets to force their way into Atrov space, but even before the plague debilitated their militaries, none could have stood against the might of the Imperium. Imperial warships crushed their disease-ridden fleets at every turn. The Imperium's methods were brutal, unethical even, but none could deny they worked. For nearly a century, Atrov space remained entirely free of any strain of the Vico plague. And, as the more sentimental species saw their nations being consumed by the disease, they began to initiate measures of equal severity. But it was too late for them. The death toll rose to the double-digit trillions. Half of the galaxy had now been infected by the Vico plague. A quarter of it had already been destroyed. The Atrov, secure behind their armadas of warships and batteries of orbital defenses, congratulated themselves on their success as the galaxy died around them. They believed themselves utterly secure from the scourge that plagued their neighbors. They soon realized that they were not. Nobody knew how the first case of Vico made it into Atrov space. Nobody knew how it could have been avoided. All anybody knew was that, in the 703rd year of the Atrov species' interstellar age, and the 308th year of their imperial age, an outbreak of Vico 1988 was confirmed on the peripheral world of Eternal Hope. Immediately, the planet's orbital garrison began bombarding the city with nuclear strikes. A planet-wide quarantine was issued not long after, with all 8 of its space elevators disconnected from the surface, and any ship trying to leave the atmosphere fired upon and destroyed. It was said that if an Atrov were bitten by a venomous animal, they would happily cut off a limb to save the body as a whole. They cut off more than just a limb that day at Eternal Hope. Even still, it was too late to save the Atrov Imperium. The infection had already spread to a dozen worlds. Immediately, the Imperium mobilized its war fleet to sterilize anything they suspected of carrying the disease. 1/10 of the Atrov Imperium was killed by their own men, their own ships, in a desperate effort to save the rest of their race from destruction. Most of those killed had not been infected, but the Atrov race could afford to be overzealous in their extermination of the disease. They knew it was better to be too paranoid than not to be paranoid enough. Still, the infection spread. Its incubation period and initial symptoms shifted with every victim it infected. The way it spread shifted with every surface it touched. The things it could endure, antiseptic, toxic atmosphere, some said even vacuum, shifted with every time it was scrubbed from a region. The Imperium, though it was more advanced than almost any other in medical science, was utterly unable to combat the disease. How could a soldier fight an enemy that adapted to his every move? Even planetary sterilization, the act of stripping a world's magnetic field in a last-ditch effort to purify it of the Vico plague, was somehow not enough to stop the spread. All antibiotics had ceased to be effective long ago. All smart defenses, such as genetically engineered immune responders, or even medical nanotechnology, were soon adapted to and overwhelmed. Only the best medics and the best equipment stood a chance at curing a patient with the virus, and they were in such short supply that it was impossible to cure them all. Besides, even if one strain was successfully cured, another would soon take over and overrun the weakened patient right afterward. Within 2 years of the infection's spread in Atrov space, the Imperium was forced to open its borders to refugees. Their mighty fleet, that which had burned armadas in the ink and snuffed out suns like a man blew out candles, was to be mighty no longer. Imperial warships had always maintained strict medical quarantines, which had grown even stricter since the Vico outbreak reached their borders. Still, it was never perfect. Food, water, medical supplies, the many strains of Vico somehow managed to survive on them all. At first, warships which reported cases of the disease were given orders to self-destruct. If they refused to obey, as many did, they were hunted down by the closest Imperial element. Even their escape pods were destroyed without hesitation. Soon, however, the Atrov Imperium could no longer afford this luxury. As more and more of their vaunted military fell ill, Imperial standards grew ever more lax. Refugees were allowed past the borders. Planetary sterilizations grew rarer by the day. Even the fleet's strict quarantine procedures were soon renounced, for what was the point of a fleet-wide quarantine if the infection was on every ship? Some small pockets of Atrov civilization remained safe from this scourge. A few warships from the fleet, some remote outposts in insignificant star systems, some fortress cities that had sealed themselves off from the outside world. They had managed to remain untouched by the Vico plague, and now they faced the very same problem the Imperium at large once did. Their nation was dying, their social order was breaking down, and the trillions of unwashed refugees, the trillions of Imperial citizens who wanted to seek shelter from the plague many already had, began to swarm these uninfected alcoves in hordes. Pitched battles broke out, Imperial waging war against Imperial, as all the rules of Atrov civilization broke down. The Atrov race had always been warlike, owing that to their fearsome reputation and a laundry list of conquests, and this was when it finally backfired. Their vaunted Imperium collapsed, not after a long and hard battle against an overwhelming enemy, but from disease and infighting. From desperate, terrified, plague-ridden Atrov who did not care how many of their fellows died, as long as they and their loved ones got the chance to live. For 2 decades, the Atrov Imperium had remained safe and secure while the Vico disease ravaged its neighbors and consumed entire worlds. For 2 decades, the Atrov race thought themselves secure behind their planetary shields and their fleets of mighty ships. Once their illusion was shattered, they responded as warlike races so frequently did, by waging a war. Except this time, the only enemy they could fight was each other. 6 years, 3 months, and 27 days after the Imperium reported its first case of the Vico outbreak, the lost Imperial died. He was a 3rd-generation Celestri immigrant, one of the many-limbed industrialists who believed technology would solve every problem, and he was proved violently wrong when a desperate Asnari refugee split open his head with an energy rifle. She died 2 days later, from suicide, after her victim's scavenged medical robot diagnosed her with the beginning stages of Vico 993. If she had not killed its owner before he could repair its faulty self-diagnostic circuit, as he had been planning to do when he was shot, the machine might have been able to tell her it was a mistake. While the Atrov Imperium locked down its borders and sealed up its worlds in an attempt to weather the storm, the other advanced races banded together in an unprecedented show of unity as they made their preparations to end it. Even species that had been rivals for centuries, such as the ever-competing Stravis and Bolars, were happy to join forces in an alliance when they saw the ruin that Vico might cause to their worlds. The greatest collective effort in the history of the galaxy was established on one fateful day, just 73 short years after the first case of Vico was reported by the Sorbial United Planets. By then, it was impossible to tell just how much of the galaxy was infected. Nobody knew exactly how many lives had been lost. Communications had been lost with most inhabited systems, as hails went unanswered and couriers often failed to return. Those that did reported such horrors that their senders usually refrained from investigating further. Given Vico's extremely contagious nature, this was a very good idea. First and foremost in the alliance, now known simply as the Galactic Unity, were the industrialist Celestri. Their collective boasted more mining, refining, and manufacturing capacity than the next 3 nations combined, and all the races of the galaxy knew to respect and fear their might. While it was initially focused on producing civilian goods, delivering mercantile resources, and fueling the collective's incessant expansion, the efforts of the Celestri industrial machine could be redirected in a matter of years to produce anything the galaxy wanted or needed. Though they may not have been able to extinguish stars like the Atrov Imperium, who had themselves caged several inside Dyson swarms, the Celestri collective possessed a form of underlying power that had the capacity to grind lesser nations to dust inside its constantly turning gears. Their power was now almost entirely redirected to the production and deployment of medical goods and services. The Astron Republic, the galaxy's dominant scientists and most well-known engineers, were quick to provide the Celestri with enhancements and upgrades to even their most advanced medical technology. The collective may have had industry, but the Republic had intelligence. Both of them combined were a force to be reckoned with. Together, the Celestri and Astrans led the fight against the disease that had claimed so many lives and ruined so many worlds. They began producing vast armies of medical robots, durable and self-sustaining automatons capable of diagnosing, treating, and even euthanizing patients should the need ever arise. Celestri and Astran warships, like those of the Atrov Imperium, were sent to quarantine infected worlds by force, and keep refugees from overflowing uninfected space. Entire sectors of the galaxy were cut off by their substantial military strength, sectors more kept alive by Galactic Unity's medical supplies and medical doctors. The 12-spoked collective emblem, stamped upon each of their creations, became a symbol of hope among the broken people of the galaxy. The Atrov Imperium was mighty, yes, but no man nor nation could stand alone in troubled times. By banding together for protection, like a herd of prey might defend itself against a circling predator, the Celestri and Astrans and all the other nations of the galaxy hoped to endure the plague and emerge victorious. And so the status quo remained for a century, while the Atrov huddled within their walls, believing themselves secure in their fortress worlds and formidable ships. The Galactic Unity gained even more members, until every nation left in the galaxy, and even some recently departed, had rallied to its banner to beat back the Vico plague. The Astran Republic immediately set to developing defenses for all the strains of Vico that were encountered, tailoring nanobot swarms to attack and destroy them, and genetically engineering new and powerful antibiotics that could sterilize a body of even the most resilient strain of any disease. As soon as the Astran laboratories were done designing and testing their ideas, the Celestri and their factories were ready to mass-produce even the most unusual of innovations. The thousands upon thousands of lesser races under their wing, humankind being one of the most principal among them, did whatever was needed to ensure the distribution and delivery of these medical supplies to wherever the infection had spread. Just 200 years ago, this level of cooperation between nations was practically unheard of. 200 years ago, the elder races were at each other's throats. 200 years ago, the same races that stood as one against destruction warred against each other over petty disputes about ideology and resources. But one's troubles always had a way of seeming small in the face of annihilation. For decades, the Galactic Unity fought a losing battle against the Vico plague. For decades, Unity machines treated diseases wherever they could, and Unity warships burned worlds where all other efforts had failed. Quarantines were established as totally as possible, and they were enforced just as forcefully as any Atrov Imperium barricade. But no quarantine could keep the Vico disease out forever. When it was discovered by a notable human microbiologist that strains of Vico had evolved to survive in even vacuum, evading even the strictest of medical screenings by clinging to the outer hull of ships, the galaxy realized why. Like fire eating at the bark of a tree, Vico began to consume the worlds at the Galactic Unity's periphery. They tried their hardest to save who they could. Celestri forges working overtime, and Astran intellectuals being strained to their limits, but it was still not enough. The death toll climbed ever higher. New worlds were written off as consumed every day. New strains constantly evolved to nullify new defenses. 4/5 of the galaxy was now empty space, peopled by nothing but the corpses of empires long past. The Galactic Unity was trying to hold on to what remained through the toil of trillions of laborers and entire star systems' worth of material wealth, but it was like stopping water with a sieve. No matter how much effort or how many bodies, mechanical or otherwise, they threw at the problem, the Unity saw the same result: failure. Quickly, it became apparent that a new strategy was needed. A new device, one that had to be capable of combating most, if not all, of the strains of Vico, had to be created. To conventional medicine, Such a task seemed impossible. Cures were easy to distribute, and even easier to develop in this enlightened age, but for every cure that the Astran Republic devised, the Vico plague evolved 10 new strains of microorganism to counter it. Antibiotics were effective on some strains, but useless against others, and they were never effective for long. Conventional science had no counter for this new form of disease. But the galactic unity was not restricted to just conventional science. The Astrans, the Celestri, and a dozen other species all put their best minds together to begin developing a medical treatment that could tailor itself to any disease, any strain of the Vico plague, and out-evolve its target in the same way that Vico had used to tear through the galaxy and leave death in its wake. Medical nanomachines were their best chance at success. The secret to producing nanobots was cracked centuries ago by the Astrans, with medical nanotechnology coming just years afterward. But the development of an evolving algorithm had been forbidden for nearly a millennium. The great mechanical uprising and the war that followed afterward ended more lives than any conflict in galactic history, even to this day, and the strictest measures were put in place to keep it from being repeated. The galactic unity took only a year to agree that such measures had to be repealed. The prospect of destruction later, at the hands of a devil they knew, was still more acceptable than destruction now by the devil they did not. Soon, all of the Astran Republic's efforts were devoted solely to making these machines. Even then, they did not succeed. Vico's lifespan was short, even for a microbe, and its DNA replication systems were faulty enough to make deviation the new norm. It replicated fast, mutated fast, and overwhelmed any obstacles in its path with sheer brute force. The Astran's prototype nanomachines were able to make great progress against Vico in any test subject they had, even when injected into terminal patients or pitted against the hardiest strains, but they often fell short of killing off the disease entirely. It seemed that, no matter how fast the nanobots adapted, or how many microbes they killed, the plague would always find a way to evolve a new defense. Untold billions had signed up to receive the prototype nanobot treatment, and those who were selected became host to tiny battlefields, not of machine against man, as it was in the great mechanical uprising of centuries ago, but machine against the odds. The Astran's pride and the galaxy's hope all condensed into a single design mere nanometers in length, fighting against an enemy that had it matched at every turn. The Astran's breakthrough had made progress, none could deny that. But equally undeniable was the fact that there was still a long way for them to go. By then, the Astran Republic and its fellow hyperpowers had moved past their condescending attitude toward the lower nations they interacted with. The Astrans and the Celestri, in unanimous agreement between their engineers, scientists, and government leaders, all agreed to share their data to every remaining nation in the hopes that cooperation might yield better results. Their medical nanomachines, while marginally effective, were far from being the miracle cure the galaxy needed. At the Astran's request and necessity's command, the galactic unity devoted its efforts to improving the Astran Republic's prototype nanobot design. Its algorithm, the one part of it that gave it a chance at fighting and beating the Vico plague, had to be improved if it was to out-evolve its enemy. But progress was slow, and the disease was not willing to wait. It was only then, in the galaxy's direst hour, that the human race finally reached its full potential. Now far from the irrelevant pests they were treated as just centuries ago, the human race had become formidable over their hundreds of years in the galaxy. They had gained allies, they had gained enemies, and most importantly, they had gained knowledge. Centuries had passed since that seemingly irrelevant human scientist made that seemingly irrelevant breakthrough in the seemingly irrelevant field of mutation on a cellular scale. Now, with galactic life on the brink of extinction, and this exact field of knowledge in more demand than ever, the nations of the galaxy realized just how relevant humanity's breakthrough was. Humankind, of course, had known it long ago. 2 centuries ago, the Astrans appeared like gods to them. All the elder races did. Every day, humans got up from their beds, went about their days, and regarded the ants on the sidewalk in the exact same fashion they felt the elder races thought about them. And, if ants were intelligent enough to think about mankind, they would surely have thought of them similarly to how humanity regarded the Astrans at the time. So, when the Astran Republic sent one of their highest officials in person to acknowledge their scientific success, that stuck with them. A compliment from God was not something one got every day. Even before the Sorbial United Planets had discovered their world of plagues and been similarly honored by the venerable Astrans, the human race saw an explosion in the field of biology. Every human in the world celebrated when the Astrans gave them that award. Every human for generations afterward heard of it. And every human who saw, heard of, or knew about the Astrans' recognition of their skill began to believe that mankind had found its niche to fill in galactic civilization. Not at that moment, of course. Perhaps not even in 100 or 1,000 years. But one day, the human race would be as knowledgeable and well regarded as the Astrans, and they would be damned if they didn't do their best to make it happen. When the Astran Republic sent out their call for help, as the galaxy died and the Vico plague spread, humanity realized that day had finally dawned, and they had been preparing for it for centuries. The human race was now regarded as the galaxy's foremost experts on the subject of mutation and evolution, biological or otherwise. Of course, humankind had already been putting forth every effort to cure the Vico disease. The elder races had considered humankind below their notice, especially with such pressing concerns as Vico to attend to. But among the lesser nations and species, humans were respected as beings of wisdom, strength, and above all, kindness. It was these very values, kindness and dignity and pride in their species, that compelled the humans to take so eagerly to the task of refining the Astrans' nanomachines. The Astran Republic even honored them with a personal visit from a high conclave member, hearkening back to the award they won centuries ago. When the Astran delegation asked, as humble as an elder race could, for humanity's help, they found the humans ready and eager to give it. Humanity's work was invaluable in refining and improving the evolutionary algorithm of the nanomachines. Within a decade, the evolutionary algorithm had been refined and improved to its very constraints. If the machines were allowed any more leeway, they might break the shackles set upon them by their creators and go rogue. A swarm of all-destroying nanobots was a threat worse than the Vico disease. Human scientists, working off of centuries of accumulated human knowledge, were the hidden piece the Astrans needed to complete their self-upgrading machines. For the first time since its discovery, the Vico plague could be beaten out of a host body for good. But the nanobot treatment's success rate was still abysmally low. The Vico plague still claimed millions of lives every day. There was still much work to be done. The Astrans tried every method to improve their algorithm further, even pushing the limits beyond what was safe. That stopped abruptly when a swarm of prototype machines went rogue, consuming 17,000 Astrans and nearly half of a Republic city before being destroyed from orbit by a Republic fleet warship. Such a tragedy hammered home the consequences of hubris, and made sure no entity pushed their nanomachines past the limits again. No entity, that is, except the humans. At first, their efforts were seen as the folly of youth. 4 centuries among the stars may have seemed like a long time, especially to a species as young as humankind. But to a race like the Astrans or the Celestri or Atrov, it was a mere speck on the galactic timeline. Entropy and enemy forces had consumed empires 10 times greater than them, and they would surely do so again. Then they showed results. A 30% success rate, more than double the Astran Cure's 13%. then 42, then 50. By then, nobody was dismissing the humans as foolish youths anymore. By the time their cure got to a 70% success rate, even the Astrons were demanding to know their secret. So, being every bit the kind and cooperative apes that first looked up to the stars and wondered what looked back down at them, they shared it. The humans' solution was so simple that the Astrons were offended they hadn't thought of it first. They had simply given the nanomachines instructions to evolve a form of communication with their handlers. No known communicator was small enough to fit inside a nanomachine hull, so the idea had already been written off as impossible. But a trillion nanobot swarm with one single purpose was a remarkably effective innovator. It took many years for the human nanomachines to evolve the required equipment. The scientist who saw their first transmission nearly fainted in shock. But the work was still completed. After that, the task of curing Vico was trivial. The adaptive and resilient nature of the nanomachines, combined with direct oversight from a team of biological or artificial doctors, made cleansing a body of Vico only a matter of time. And with each patient cured, the swarms evolved to be stronger. Vico's greatest strength was being used to destroy it. After only 20 years, the last case of Vico was announced as cured by the galactic unity. Every race still alive chanted humanity's name. The remaining elder races now welcomed mankind as an equal into their ranks. Not one of them had ever ascended so fast. The scourge had been ended. The crisis was over. At humanity's command, the rebuilding began. Their breakthroughs in nanobot technology, many of which they shared free of charge, quickly made them the envy of every civilized species. The Atrov remnant's mightiest armada was crushed to dust by human pirates. The Asnal Forum's best artworks were put to shame by the intricate beauty of a specialized nanobot swarm. The Celestri Collective's entire industrial output was put to shame by human constructor nanobots. The Astron Republic now looked to humanity for knowledge, happily receiving the same scientific accolades it had once bestowed. The galaxy once thought humanity was a weak species. They were right. They also believed humans would never amount to much, never have their name spoken from the galactic core to the furthest star, never rise above the clamor to make their voice clearly heard. And in that, they could not have been more wrong.